think they're coming. We trust that they are coming.
This time. Okay, so let's continue. So let's go back now. Since we are saying we found these factors on which the threshold fixed costs depend. So how can we use those to test for the presence, for the relevance of fixed costs of participation, of entry and participation. And one approach that has been taken was to, by Wissing Jorgensen in 2004 and Monica Paiella in 2005, was to say, okay, let's go to the data and let's look at non-participants in the data. And we observe certain, lots of things about them, like, their income, their liquid assets, all sorts of other, age, education, all sorts of other things. And then, the idea that they applied was to say, okay, let's make an assumption about how much these people would be holding if they entered the stock market. Okay? So that's an assumption that they were making. And then they were saying, okay, given the rest of their characteristics, what is the threshold fixed cost that would keep them out of the stock market? And the outcome of this was that this threshold fixed cost is actually pretty small, so pretty reasonable, right? So it was of the order of $200 a year or something like that back in the early 2000s, and that's a very modest level of cost, and it's not unreasonable to say, especially the combination of transactions costs and opportunity costs in Pacifico, that this would be, in that range. But they were focusing more on objective costs, objective transactions costs, fixed costs, and they were saying this reason. Now, compared to our paper, this type of approach, there is a plus and a minus of those papers. So the advantage of those papers over ours was that they are looking at actual data, real data, right, of stockholders and non-stockholders, and they are using that real data to compute their threshold fixed cost. The disadvantage of their approach was that they had to guess, to make an assumption about how much these people would hold in stocks if they were to enter. And of course, again, if you are thinking about fixed cost on the left-hand side, equity premium times desired holdings on the right-hand side, if I'm guessing the desired holdings, I'm influencing, these cost estimates quite a bit, right? So it is a bit arbitrary, but still it gives from the other side, it gives some confirmation of the plausibility of fixed costs as an explanation. Our paper from this side gives plausibility because the properties of these threshold fixed costs are reasonable the way we have discussed. Okay. Now, the other key insight from fixed costs is that the presence of fixed costs renders other factors relevant. So, normally I joke and I say, with the initial reductio ad absurdum, I am destroying your relationship with your grandmother because she will be telling you why people are not participating in the stock market, and you'll be telling her, oh no, this doesn't work, that doesn't work, this doesn't, But in the presence of fixed costs, suddenly all the factors that matter for the size of stock holdings, right, matter for participation. So if you are poor, if you don't have a lot of resources, you are going to have very limited demand for stocks. So you're not going to enter because you don't want to pay the ticket fee, right? And if you are if you are very risk averse, okay, subject to the problem that I noted, but if you are not willing to invest a lot in stocks, let me put it more generally, not in terms of the risk aversion parameter, but in terms of your demand for stocks. So if you have limited demand for stocks for reasons of risk aversion or for reasons of, or your perceived equity premium is limited because of trust or because of taxes or because of pessimism, then you're not going to enter. So lots of factors that Grandma would naturally think about are coming into play once you introduce the fixed cost. But they might not be there. They will not in general be there. And borrowing constraints, the same thing, because if you're subject to borrowing constraints, you cannot really borrow to expand your desired stock holding. And departures from expected utility, anything that limits your demand for stocks, would work. So, going further, if we are going to survey data, etc., the factors that affect either the level of fixed costs that the household has to pay or the expected size of the benefit, the equity premium, the perceived equity premium, the desired stock holdings, conditional mentally, any of these factors should be empirically relevant, should have statistically significant effects on the decision to participate. Okay? So this opens up, the analysis, the potential for testing to a whole range of possible factors. That could influence any of these aspects that are relevant for the decision, the choice to participate. So the typical empirical specification here is a probit and less frequent logic regression that you did, right, in discrete choice models. And if you are looking at the risky portfolio share, then it's a topic. And so typically that's what people are using, and the most obvious maybe of the controls or of the test is to find to look at control for other things and to look what's happening with college graduates versus less educated people, because these are going to face lower cost of participation. They know more things, they find it easier, less costly to find out even more things than they know. Also, those with larger current financial resources would want to have larger holdings, and that would influence the participation in the presence of fixed costs. Those facing or perceiving higher equity premium for the pessimism, trust, informational reasons, they would have larger holdings as well. So these are some obvious things to try in the regression framework. Okay, so what I want to do now is to take you through a little bit of a tour of data and what we do with those, and I want to illustrate what conclusions we can reach from different types of data and analysis, right? and what conclusions we cannot reach, because it's very dangerous to be drawn to conclusions just by observing some statistics or some draw some column graphs or typically column graphs, etc., and or pie charts or whatever, and make wrong inferences that are not justified. Okay, first of all, in terms of definition, I have already mentioned direct stock holding are stocks held directly. Total stock holding includes direct holdings plus indirect holdings. And I'll start with late 90s data, and these indirect holdings are mutual funds to the extent that these invest at least part of the portfolio in stocks. So you cannot simply add the total amount invested in funds. I mean, sometimes you do this for brevity or to save time, but ideally you would want to know to save time, or if it is not reported in the data, how much these mutual funds are invested in stocks, right? So in earlier data, in early data there was no information on mutual funds, whether they invest in stocks or not, and then in subsequent early data there was this information. I hold so much in stock mutual funds, in funds that invest partly in stocks, and I hold the rest in bond mutual funds. Right. And then you don't know exactly how much of the first category is actually invested in stocks, but then the tendency is to put everything in stocks. I mean, to assume that everything is in stocks, and you're getting a sort of upper bound on stock holdings of these people. But for participation, if they don't tell you that they invest in stock funds, if they tell you that they invest everything in bond funds, money market funds, financial assets that don't include stocks, then you put participation to zero, stock market participation to zero. So, in the late 90s, for European countries, it was impossible to know if mutual funds invested in stocks. Okay, so here is the first set of charts, and here it is from the late 90s data in the Household Portfolios book, and you see the countries we had data on back then. You see France, Italy, Netherlands, Sweden, UK, and the US. And what you see here is two bars, right? So this is, the first bar is direct stock market participation among people who don't have a college degree. And the second bar is direct stock market participation among people who have a college degree, right? And you see that in all countries, if you have a college, a larger share of college graduates are holding stocks compared to non-college graduates. So this is true. So the stock market participation is not the same across all these countries. Direct stock market participation is not the same. You see UK here, I told you, Thatcher. You see Sweden, where I told you they have the highest stock market participation in the world. You see the US over here, and you see the European countries, the other European countries lower. So the level of overall direct participation is not the same across countries, but what is true is that in each country, college graduates, participation among college graduates is higher. And here you include also direct and indirect holdings. So either you participate in stocks directly or indirectly. So these numbers are definitely going to be bigger than these numbers, at least as big as these numbers, as the first panel. And you see that again it is the case that college graduates, participation among college graduates is higher. And you see some very significant differences. Look at Italy here. Huge difference between non-college graduates and college graduates. Now, what I just, the way I described it is correct, to the best of my knowledge, right? That among college graduates, participation is higher. You can say that, okay? What you cannot say, just by looking at these graphs, is that this is because of the college degree. That this is because of higher education that they got. Because, you know, a college degree correlates with lots of other things that you're not controlling for, right? If you have a college degree, you're likely going to have higher income level at any given age, for example, and higher wealth level, etc. So you cannot attribute all of this difference, or even part of this difference, to the college degree. It could be due to correlated factors. Right? But you can report that among college graduates, you know, participation rates are high. Then you look at the income distribution, and here we look at the financial wealth distribution, right? So how do you do this? You take the households in your data set for each country, and you rank them according to income, the reported income in the survey. You rank them, and then you get the top 10%. That's the top decile in the income distribution. You get only those people, and you say, what is the share of those people, of those households that are participating in the stock market, you know, directly or indirectly, right? And that's one number, you know, that's one point on your plot, and another point for total stockholding. And then you go to the second 10%, and you do the same all the way to the bottom. Okay. Now you see here for Germany, we only have one curve because there was no data on mutual funds in Germany, right? So we couldn't compute the second one, but back then, right? Not now. But for the others, we could get the two. And what you know, and there are a number of things that you can see here. So that, you know, and here actually with financial assets, it's the same. You do the same. So you rank households in the data by level of financial assets, and the top decile would be this, and you put the number, you know, the point. So one thing that is obvious from, you know, all the graphs here is that as you are in the top two deciles, you know, participation rates explode. Top 2 or 3 deciles, participation rates really go up, okay, relative to the rest of the population. So people who are in the top deciles of the wealth or the income distribution are significantly more likely to participate in the stock market directly or indirectly. But this statement is a descriptive statement. Again, I'm not saying this is because of the wealth. I can't say that just from descriptive graphs, but I am saying that, you know, participation rates in the top wealth deciles and income deciles are much higher than in the rest. Then another thing you can see is that, you know, exactly how high participation rates are in the top deciles depends on the country. It's not the same across countries, right? And over here, you know, look at the U.S. and look at Italy. I mean, you know, striking difference in the levels at the top. But when you go to the bottom of the distribution, you know, the bottom, the least rich in terms of wealth or in terms of income are equally unlikely, pretty much equally unlikely to participate across most of the countries. In Sweden, it's not the case. I'll tell you why Sweden is so exceptional. So the poor, you know, I don't know if somebody said that, if there is some statement in Karl Marx saying that the poor are all alike in stock market participation, I doubt it. But they are, right? But the rich are very different from the poor, and they are different internationally. Okay. Now, why is Sweden such a special case? Because, you know, if we go back to what I was describing yesterday, the three pillars of the retirement, of the pension system, remember the first pillar is Social Security taxes, and you have a second pillar which are occupational pension plans, and you have a third pillar which are private pension plans, right? And you guys will initiate private, maybe occupational, but also private pension plans in Vietnam, and you're going to get all three pillars in the future, yeah? Because you will know the household finance, you know, to do that. Okay. So normally, you know, stockholding in practically all of the countries, stockholding starts with occupational, may start with occupational pension plans, and is definitely there in private pension plans, right? But in Sweden, it actually starts with Social Security, the Social Security system. So instead of telling you you are paying a tax, a Social Security tax, right? They say that you have to take 2.5% of your income, your labor income, make the Social Security contribution, you know, equal to that, and invest this amount in a fund, right? In a mutual fund, in a retirement fund. And you have a choice of which fund. And in fact, they give you choice of 600, among 600 funds to pick in. And, you know, some have more stocks in them, others less stocks, you know, all sorts of different characteristics. 600 is a huge number. I mean, it's really a big challenge to choose among 600, you know, funds. But if you don't check, you know, the box that says I want to choose, then you are automatically assigned to a fund that's determined by the government, right? And it may be, even there may be a little bit of choice, but, or a little bit of randomness, you know, where you're allocated among 5, 6 funds, etc. Okay, so why am I telling you this? Because, first of all, if you include retirement accounts, then all of these people become automatically stockholders. But even if you don't include this first pillar of retirement accounts, the data typically don't. These people who are now getting used to stockholding through their pension plans are likely to be investing in stocks even in their taxable accounts, their mutual funds, maybe even direct stockholding, etc. So there is a learning aspect to having this type of Social Security system, to being forced to invest in a mutual fund in the first pillar already, right? And a spillover to stock market participation, direct or indirect, in other types of accounts, not only in the Social Security account. Yes, makes sense? So that's why Sweden is really huge. And I'm not sure if Norway does exactly this, but I think it does something close to this. And you get a lot of stock market participation there as well. And recall what I told you, that the 53% stock market participation in the US is mostly due to retirement accounts, to stocks in retirement accounts, defined contribution, occupational pension plans, or stock individual retirement accounts, private retirement accounts. So what you do with the pension system tends to generate, to influence equity culture, willingness to hold stocks more generally. Okay, so that's on the distribution of resources. But as I said, again, you cannot say that the position in the distribution of resources is the reason, is the factor, right? You can just report. Now, the final thing I want to show you, participation by age. So here, these are cross-sectional data. These are not panel data. I mean, ideally, you would want to observe the same people as they age and to track their participation, choices as they age, and also the amounts they hold in stocks as they age, etc. But here you don't have that option. It's cross-sectional data. It's just for 1 year. So instead of comparing me when I was 20 years old to me when I'm 60 years old or 65 or something, you're comparing me to you. Okay? So we're comparing different people. And then you can do that, of course, and you plot what's going on, what are the participation rates at different ages. And you see that the general impression here, maybe with a little bit of deviation here, but the general impression is a hump-shaped relationship, an inverted U relationship, right, between age and participation rates. And you see how pronounced it is here in the US. Which means what? That when you are young, you are not very likely to participate. When you are old, you are not very likely, here in retirement, you are not very likely to participate. But in the middle, right, during your working life, and especially the second half of your working life, and even the first years of your retirement, you are quite likely to participate in the stock market. Okay? Now, is it age, right? I mean, I can describe this, and I can tell you there is lower participation among the young and the old, and there is much higher participation in the middle. But is the reason for this age? Is this an age effect? Is it an effect of age, or is it an effect of something else? And you see that especially with age, lots of things correlate, right? So your income correlates. You start at lower salaries, lower income, and you gain seniority, and your income goes up and up until you retire, and then it goes down, with the pension. So what am I describing? I'm describing a hump-shaped profile of income, right? And then you see that there is it correlates with age. So maybe age has nothing to do with this, and it's all about income. And then you think about wealth, and what's going on with financial assets and financial wealth. You start with zero or close to zero, little at the beginning, and then maybe you are de-saving at the beginning, you're borrowing, so your net wealth is even negative. But your financial assets, if you don't consider net wealth, you consider just the level of financial assets, it can be zero. And then you start accumulating later on. And you keep accumulating for your old age, so you keep accumulating pretty much until the last year that you're working. And then you start accumulating later on. So what am I describing? I'm describing a hump-shaped wealth level, right, plotted against age. So it may have nothing to do with age, it may have nothing to do with income, or something to do with income. It may have a lot to do with wealth. So we can't tell. So I told you we can't tell, but we can run regressions, right? We can run regressions to control for other factors. So the first solution, and historically the first solution, we thought about in this, for this problem that from graphs you cannot infer causality, was let's try to control for other factors. And let's see what is the contribution of college education, what is the contribution of the income decile, the wealth decile, or of age when we're controlling for other factors, right? And if I were teaching you 10 years ago, I wouldn't make this distinction, but now I have to make this distinction because the profession, household finance has also evolved very much. The econometrics in household finance has evolved very, very much, and has been influenced quite a bit by labor econometrics, labor microeconometrics. And the labor people are crazy when it comes to econometrics. I mean, they are really extremely demanding. They won't let you assume that anything is exogenous. They will tell you even gender is endogenous because you can change it. No? They probably won't, but I'm making this up. But just to give you an indication of how demanding the field has become, and certainly in labor microeconometrics, it's hell on earth. But also household finance, there is a lot of emphasis now on causality and on identification of exogenous effects and things like that. So now I have to distinguish between two types of regressions, sort of descriptive regressions, which sounds kind of strange, right? Because we normally talk about descriptive statistics. So what are descriptive regressions? Well, they are regressions where I'm not sure, I can't establish that the changes on the right-hand side, the variables on the right-hand side are exogenous, right? So they are descriptive. They allow you to control for other things, but again, they don't point to causality 100%. Versus causal regressions that are pointing to causality. So, in terms of descriptive regressions, our findings on education survive when you control for other factors. So even controlling for other factors. I mean, I told you participation among college graduates is higher, right? But this may be due to the higher income, the higher wealth, other factors. Even when you control for the other factors, the college degree dummy variable is statistically significant and positive, right? So even controlling for other factors, college graduates are more likely to participate, or there is positive correlation between college education and stock market participation. Okay? So the way to phrase these conclusions so that you don't get into trouble with the identification police is to say that there is positive correlation between having a college degree and stock market participation, controlling for other factors, right? Even controlling for other factors. And the same is true for income and financial wealth. So even controlling for other factors, higher position in the income or in the financial wealth distribution correlates with a higher participation rate, is associated with a higher participation rate. Okay? But if you do a regression for age controlling for other things, then the handshake relationship is not confirmed. Age, as we're going to do a whole PowerPoint on age. Age is a really tough exercise. Estimating age effects is a really tough exercise. So we'll come back to that. But it's not, if you do the simple descriptive regression, you don't find a statistically significant effect for age in US data. Now, here is an example. I mean, this is again from that early paper, but just to show you, these are not all the things we control for, but this is the college dummy. And of course, the omitted dummy is non-college. And here are age dummies, and you see that we have age ranges. Of course, there is an alternative to doing, two things I want to say. First, there has to be an omitted age range, so the young here, under 30. So all of these possible changes or differences that we are estimating are relative to the young group, right? And you see here they are not statistically significant. And here they are not statistically significant, and over here there is some, pattern of statistical significance, but it's not consistent across all the groups. A second nerdy statement is, why are we doing this? Why are we distinguishing different age groups like that? Because we have the precise age of these people. So why don't we put 32 and we put them in a category age 31 to 40? And we could have done that, but then we would have had to assume some functional form linking participation to age. And what is it exactly? Is it a second order polynomial? Is it a higher order polynomial? What on earth is it? We would have to assume this a priori. When you do this, when you specify categories, you let the data speak. You let the data pick up any pattern, like up and down, the thumb shape that I was talking about, etc. So it's more flexible. It's a more flexible specification. And here we do the same for income quartiles and for wealth quartiles, and we are omitting the poorest people in terms of income and the poorest in terms of wealth. Yeah. So there are two senses in which you can be wealthy, right? So here is, so before you marry somebody, you have to ask them first, are they income rich? And second, are they assets rich? Right? Do they have high income and do they have high wealth? And only if they say yes to both, you proceed. Okay, so you can be income, wealth rich and income poor. I mean, you can be a retiree living in a beautiful house, so your wealth is high, but actually your pension is very tiny. So you're income poor and assets rich, right? So when we talk about wealthy, we normally have to specify what we're talking about. And it's typically about the level of wealth in household finance. Otherwise, we want to specify. So do you see here, you see lots of asterisks here. So there is a lot of statistical significance when we look at income or wealth quartiles, and again, it's flexible specification, and we are comparing to the poorest in each distribution, right? And you find, not only do you find, for example, look at income or look at wealth, these estimates are not only statistically significant, but the point estimates are going up in size as you are going through the wealth distribution, up the distribution, wealth or income distribution. Okay, so that was all for participation rates. But you can also do regressions for the conditional portfolio share. So what is the conditional portfolio share? Well, you take your data and you kill the people who are not participating in stocks, and you're keeping the rest, okay? And then you say, among the people who participate in stocks, what is the risky portfolio share? And you can compute the median risky portfolio share, conditional on participation. You can compute the mean risky portfolio share, conditional participation, etc. Now, you can also include everybody, not kill the non-participants, include non-participants and participants, and then compute the mean portfolio share and the median portfolio share. But chances are that if you do that, the median portfolio share will be 0, because maybe in most countries the median household is not participating in the stock market. So you're not learning much from that. And the mean portfolio share is so, averages are so influenced by the extremes that, including the zeros there is not really helping you. You're not learning much about, stock holding behavior by including the zeros. That's why we want to focus on the conditional portfolio share. But here comes a problem in regressions, okay? You say, okay, I want to estimate the factors that influence the portfolio share conditional on participation, on stock market participation. So the first thing that may come to mind, grandma will think of is, let me ignore the non-participants. Let me just focus on the participants, and let me run a regression on the participants only, right? You can do that. Nobody is going to prevent you from doing that, but this is a descriptive regression only among non-participants. You can, only among participants. You can only make statements about participants by using that regression, right? You can say, among participants, a college degree controlling for other characteristics is associated, say, with a larger risky portfolio share or a lower risky portfolio share. You can make those statements. But you are missing the first stage of this, which is the choice of whether to participate or not. You cannot make statements about the population as a whole, just looking at stock market participants, because this is a selected sample, right? They overcame some hurdle to enter the stock market. You can think of it as these fixed costs. You can think of it as any other factor that we have sort of discussed. But they overcame this hurdle, so they are a selected group. It's like looking at you and trying to make general statements about the population in Vietnam. You are a selected group, right? You made it to the master's program at BGU, right? I cannot just look at you and make inferences about the entire population of Vietnam. So how can it be done? How can we look at the conditional portfolio share? Well, it can either be done in two stages. So has anybody talked to you about the Heckman correction for selection? Yes? Yes. Yes. So either you do a two-stage Heckman procedure, right? So you correct for the selected sample, and then you can make statements about people, the role of college education or other things for the risky portfolio share conditional on participation, right? You can do that. Or you can run a Tobit regression, right? Where the risky portfolio share is between 0 and 1, and in the 0, of course, you include everybody, right? You include the non-participants in the 0, and you include the participants, who are going to be somewhere between 0 and 1. And then you can compute, the marginal effects conditional on participation, even in the topic, conditional on participation, on a non-zero data observation. So you can do these things. Now, if you do these things, what do you find? So what you typically find is that there is a lot more action in the first stage regression, in the participation regression, than in the conditional risky portfolio share regression. Meaning that very few variables are statistically significant in the conditional risky portfolio share, but lots of variables are significant in the participation regression, which, in terms of economic interpretation, suggests that then there is a lot of inertia in stock holding, because what would it mean? If the conditional risky portfolio share is dependent on, a bunch of characteristics like your income, your wealth, a lot. It's dependent a lot on your income, on your wealth, on your age, on your education, on. Then whenever there is a change in any of these factors, and notably income and wealth, or age, etc., there should be a change in the risky portfolio share, right? But the fact that we are finding statistical insignificance suggests that the risky portfolio share is stable, it's pretty stable. So the big decision for you is whether to hold stocks or not. And once you hold stocks, you're not going to be varying your stock exposure very much whenever, some of your other characteristics change. Okay. Yeah? Makes sense? So that's consistent with portfolio inertia. We're going to see portfolio inertia. Okay. So what did I tell you? So I interject now a little bit of theory to go. So in this course, the joke, the mathematician who said half of his body was in the freezer and the other half was in the oven, and he said, on average, I'm okay. Yeah? You know this joke? Okay, so we go from data to theory, we go to extreme theory, extreme data. On average, we will be okay, right? But it's jumping up and down. Okay. So now let's go back to theory, because what did I? It was on the previous PowerPoint. You saw the downward sloping risky portfolio share, and I told you we're not getting that in the data. What we are getting in the data is, not many things are significant, okay, but income and wealth are positive, and it's a rather flat profile in the US data. So this thing should be horizontal, it should not be going down, or it should be slightly upward sloping. It should not be going down. So here is a model that Wachter and Yogo came up with, which actually justifies the wealthy having higher risk exposures, right? And it's interesting in terms of solving this risky portfolio share problem, but it's also interesting in terms of what it implies, right? And I'll come back to the interpretation. Okay, so here they introduce non-monetary utility specific. So let me say this. So a mediocre theorist or a low level theorist would look at this problem that I described to you, that the risky portfolio share is going down and it should be flat or going up, and would try to make some assumption about risk aversion, about something that really influences very directly the risky portfolio share. And then this would have been something very obvious and a very obvious touch, and too direct, and maybe not so reasonable, not so realistic. But what these people thought was much deeper. They said, okay, just a second, maybe the problem with our standard model that's causing, creating this downward sloping risky portfolio share, maybe the problem is that we are oversimplifying the consumption side, not the savings side, but the consumption side. We are saying that there is one consumption good, this capital C, and we are choosing how many units of that consumption good to consume, right? But in reality, there is a variety of consumption goods. So let's go from one type to two. Let's go from one consumption good to basic good to necessities and to luxuries, okay? So let's distinguish between necessities and luxuries. And they went back to Haltaker in 1960, who was a microeconomist, and he was trying to estimate demand systems and things. So he needed to distinguish between basic goods and luxury goods. Okay, so now here is the specification, and this is the period. This is not the intertemporal problem, this is utility in one period, okay? And you have the level of necessities that you're consuming raised to a power 1 minus lambda, and you have the amount of luxuries raised to a different power 1 minus phi. And if in the special case of lambda equals phi, this is homothetic, but they impose the restriction that lambda is greater than phi, greater than or equal to phi, greater than 1. Okay. And then there is this coefficient over here. Okay. So, what does it mean exactly to say that lambda is bigger than phi? Well, you know, if we had risk and constant relative risk aversion utility function, you know, we would raise consumption to 1 minus rho. Here we are raising necessities to 1 minus lambda, and we are raising luxuries to a different exponent, 1 minus phi. Our rho would capture how averse we are to the riskiness of consumption. So here, when we have two types of goods, you know, the exponent, this lambda, captures how averse we are to risking necessities, and phi captures how averse we are to risking or to variability of luxuries. Okay? So, what do you say to grandma? You say to grandma that in this model, people are assumed to care more about the risking necessities than about risking luxuries. Okay? Does it make sense? Yes, it makes sense. You care less about risking the second Lamborghini, right, than risking the milk of your children, so to speak, right? So it makes perfect sense. And this would be the key to deriving the results. Now, you see a complicated parameter here. Well, that governs substitutability of luxuries and necessities within the period. Okay, so that's where this is coming. Okay. How about intertemporal utility? I mean, this is just for one period, right? How about intertemporal utility? You take this combination of necessities and luxuries, and you raise the utility from that, you raise it to 1 minus gamma, and divide by 1 minus gamma. So it is constant relative risk aversion intertemporally, and we have this more intricate structure within period. Now, what can you show with a setup like this? What can be shown is that as people are getting richer, so they are raising their consumption level because their budget constraint is pushed outwards, right? They are able to consume more. As people are able to consume more, they are shifting more towards luxuries and away from necessities. Meaning that the budget share, the share of consumption that goes to luxuries goes up, and the share of consumption that goes to necessities goes down. Indeed, this is the definition of a luxury good, right? That there's, as income goes up and the budget constraint shifts outwards, you tend to increase disproportionately the consumption of the luxury good, then reduce the proportion of the necessity. Okay? Now, thinking about our problem and trying to get to the root of our problem, who are the people who are richer, who are the people who have the higher income? We're talking about higher permanent income, right? So the higher permanent income people are going to be exhibiting this tilt towards luxuries and away from necessities. Okay? Here now is the policy rule for the risky share. Okay, so it's always nice if you can draw a three-dimensional graph. It doesn't matter what you say, it looks impressive, right? Okay. But actually, here they are finding a very interesting thing. So you have a three-dimensional graph, and look at it carefully. The zeros are here, right? They're not there. The 0, 0 is here. So what are they plotting here? They are plotting normalized cash on hand. So they are starting from this, and here is the direction of increasing normalized cash on hand. And over here, they are plotting permanent income, the level of permanent income. So here is the direction of increasing permanent income, right? Now, and on the vertical axis, they are plotting the risky portfolio share. So this is a plot of the policy function of the risky portfolio share. Now, in our standard model, that was a two-dimensional graph, right? I didn't have to draw a three-dimensional graph. But why was I able to draw a two-dimensional graph? Permanent income was still a state variable, but because the model was homothetic, the standard model was homothetic, I could divide everything by permanent income. I could normalize everything by permanent income. So I was getting, it was the normalized cash on hand, and I was getting normalized consumption as a function of normalized cash on hand, etc. So I could get rid of one state variable, the permanent income state variable, just because of homotheticity. But this model over here is not homothetic. The exponents of necessities and luxuries are not the same. So if I double both, I'm not going to get double utility, right? I'm going to influence utility. So I cannot, because the model is not homothetic, I cannot normalize by permanent income. I have to maintain it as a separate state variable, okay? And I need to plot a three-dimensional policy function. Do you understand, or have you lost me? Has the ship departed from the port? You are waving me goodbye? What is happening? Are you with me? Are you on the boat with me, or are you waving me goodbye? What's happening? The smile suggests that you are waving me goodbye. Okay. So here, right, you see that the exponents are different on B and L. It is not the case that if I double B and I double L, I'm going to get double utility. So I cannot make use, I cannot say that V of 2B, 2L is twice B. So I cannot pre-multiply, B and L by anything like multiply B and L by anything like 1 over permanent income. I cannot multiply B by 1 over B and L by 1 over B and get 1 over B here, right? I cannot do that. I have to keep P, permanent income, as an additional state variable. So I have X as a state variable, or I'm happy, to have X over P as a state variable. There's no problem with that. But I still have to keep P. I'm not eliminating P by dividing cash on hand by P, by normalizing by P, right? So that's what I'm saying. Whereas, in the other model, in the standard model, it's homothetic. I can get rid of one state variable by dividing by it. So here I have to keep it. Okay. So look, suppose you raise a vertical axis here. You draw a vertical axis over here, and you are going in this direction. What do you see? So here you have fixed permanent income. I mean, if you want, you can do it over here to be even more realistic. That permanent income is not 0, permanent income is 0.5. Totally fine. You're going to get the same things. But if you draw a perpendicular here and you start going in this direction, what you're plotting is the risky portfolio share as normalized cash on hand goes up, right? So what do you see? That's downward sloping. That is exactly what we have found in the standard model. What were we doing in the standard model? We were plotting the risky portfolio share as a function of normalized cash on hand, and it was downward sloping, right? Beyond the constraint range. What are they finding here? They are finding that even, so you slice it like that, slice it at 0.5 or whatever, and you are finding a downward sloping risky portfolio share, exactly like we found in the standard case. Okay? So that's a beautiful thing because, why is that? For the same reason that I had said before, that if you are fixing permanent income and you are going out in terms of normalized cash on hand, you are more likely to have high wealth relative to permanent income. And that's why you are out there at high normalized cash on hand. And if you have high wealth, you don't want to take such big risks with your high wealth because a lot of your consumption depends on your wealth. So it's exactly the same finding and the same reasoning as in the standard model. But now we have this direction as well. We have the other fact. Okay? So you can go here, you can say normalized cash on hand of 2, raise, drop the perpendicular here and slice the mountain or, this three-dimensional graph in this direction, right? Slice in this direction. And what do you find? You find that as permanent income increases, the risky portfolio share goes up, right? So now you have two competing effects when you're talking about rich people. On the one hand, the rich people are likely to have a higher normalized cash on hand for given permanent income. And that part alone is going to lower their optimal risk exposure, right? The risky portfolio share. On the other hand, there are people with higher permanent income, and this fact is going to raise their risk exposure. So which dominates? Which thing dominates? Well, it depends, right? It's an empirical matter, and theoretically it's a matter of calibration. You calibrate the model based on reasonable data parameters, and then you run simulations and you see which effect dominates. And it turns out that actually this effect dominates. So the people with higher permanent income are ending up with higher risky portfolio shares despite this effect, which is still present but is dominated by the other. Okay. Now grandma, you explain this to grandma and she will say, I don't understand where this is coming from. In particular, why is this upward sloping? Okay. Well, go back to this property of the model, right? households with higher permanent income allocate a lower share of total consumption to the basic good, the necessity, and a bigger share to the luxury. Why is it the case that higher permanent income people, right, are willing to invest more in the stock market? Because the higher the permanent income, the higher the share of luxuries in your consumption. So the higher the permanent income, when the bigger the share of luxuries that you are risking. You are risking mostly luxuries if you are a high permanent income person. If you are a low permanent income person, you are risking mostly necessities, right? So you are willing to take more risks as you grow, as you get higher permanent income, because what you are risking is mostly luxuries, and you can afford to risk luxuries, right? If you are poor, you are risking necessities, and you can't afford to lose necessities. So that's why this model, how this model works, and how it generates the result. And it is, I have a lot of admiration for this model, because these people didn't think to do some hardwired, correction for the risky portfolio share. They thought, they went back to first principles, right? And they said, okay, let's think luxuries, necessities. And, let's think about these considerations, and these considerations, matter. Okay? So that's the crux of the model. Now, and it's delivering through computations. It is delivering, okay, so these two opposite effects, and through computations, it is delivering upward sloping risky portfolio shares, with the exception of the youngest households. The permanent income effect dominates in simulations, bringing about a positive overall relation between wealth and the portfolio share. Okay, there is also a prediction about age, but before I go there, I want to prevent that you wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning sweating and thinking about this diagram and thinking, what on earth are we doing here? So here is a nerdy detail so that you don't wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Okay, so what is normalized cash on hand? Well, it is X divided by B, right? And what is permanent income? Permanent income is P. Okay? So, if we are fixing permanent income here, for example, and we are moving in this direction, how are we varying the normalized cash on hand, which has P, if we're fixing it, right? So once you see it, it's trivial, of course. We are fixing P. So if we are moving in this direction, we have a fixed P, we have fixed it, right? So all of the change here is coming from X. So if you are at any given level of P and you stay on that level of P, you are moving here, it means you are considering higher cash on hand, unnormalized cash on hand for given P, right? Now, if you are here and you are moving in this direction over here, you are fixing X over P, you are fixing X over P, you are increasing P. So how can that happen? Well, it means that if you double, if you increase P by 20%, you have to increase X by 20%. So as you are moving in this direction, you are increasing permanent income, and you're also increasing X, wealth plus actual labor income. or or actually wealth, the wealth level. So X over P is equal to A over P A over B plus U, right? The transitory shock. So as you are moving to the right here, as you are increasing permanent income, you are multiplying A by the increase in permanent income. You are increasing permanent income by 20%, you are increasing wealth by 20%, and you're leaving the transitory shock as it is. Okay? So that's the nature of the exercise, going this direction and that direction. It's not a mistake or it's not a big mystery what's going on. Okay, that's a nerdy detail so that you don't wake up. Okay. There are also predictions about age in the model. And here, what you find is what they find is that the portfolio share has a non-decreasing age profile. So let's go back to the standard model, right? The standard model with finite horizon, what does it say? That as you are increasing age, you have smaller human wealth and you are relying more, ahead of you, so you're relying more and more on your financial wealth to finance consumption. So as you are increasing age, you should be moving out of stocks. You should be taking less risks with stocks, right? So that effect is present also here, right? That effect is inherited from the standard model as well. But now there is a second effect that goes in the opposite direction. As you are growing older, your permanent income goes up, right? As you are growing older, you tend to be risking luxuries more and necessities less. So again, you have this conflicting effect. You have the moderation that should come with age because you are relying primarily on your wealth, and you have the increased willingness to take risks because you are mostly risking luxuries rather than necessities. So again, it is an empirical matter or a calibration, computational matter which effect dominates, and what they find is that the model produces a relatively flat age profile in the portfolio share, so it doesn't go up necessarily, doesn't go down with age, and it's more realistic in the sense that it conforms, as you will see, to the empirical findings on age using US data, okay? So it's more realistic, whereas the standard model tells you that you should be that people will be getting progressively out of stocks as they're getting older, okay? So they have made significant progress with this paper, both in terms of what's happening to wealthier people, what's happening to the risky portfolio share, and what's happening to older people with the risky portfolio share. Okay? Happy? Are you happy? Are you excited? Okay, so let me get rid of this, and let me proceed. And the next topic is the topic from health, age effects, right? I told you that it's going to be quite complicated. So let me share this with you. Okay. So this is what we saw, right? We saw hump-shaped age profiles, right, of participation in the data. So now let's go to a very famous paper which was written by Amerix and Zeldes in 2005, and it is still unpublished. It's a working paper. It's certainly the most famous working paper in household finance, which is unpublished. You know, so I think for some reason, you know, it's a little bit of a negative paper, so they couldn't publish it at the beginning, and then I know for a fact that they no longer want to publish it. They want to play it cool and unpublished, because at some point I was editor of a journal, and I offered them to publish it like that, and I didn't get a response. They don't care. Okay, so this is Amerix and Zeldes, and Amerix was working in the TIAA-CREF pension fund, and TIAA-CREF is the pension fund of US-based academics. And I want to tell you that, you know, as a result of him working there, they could get data on TIAA-CREF pension accounts. So they could observe these people over time, over 10 years. And I want to tell you that I am one of the data points in the sample that they used, because at that time I still am. I mean, I still have pension accumulation that I built up in my assistant professor days in the US. Okay, so here is the risky portfolio share. We have been calling it alpha, they call it omega. Okay, so the first versus the last letter of the Greek alphabet. Okay, so they went for the last. Now, in general, what does the risky portfolio share depend on? And they highlight the following three things here. The following five, I would say. Okay, but three are the crucial ones. The first determinant is age, right? The risky portfolio share is a function of the age of the person. The second is, the third here is time, right? As time goes by, the risky portfolio share may be changing, even for given age. The second thing is the cohort, the birth cohort. So yes, this person is 50 years old, but were they born in, 1975, or were they born in 1900? That should make some difference as well, even if I'm observing them at the same age, right? Wealth is a crucial determinant, and here this Z variable is a catch-all variable. So this is, all other demographic and other characteristics that we have in our data, and we care to include in the risky portfolio share regression. But of course, the emphasis is on these three things. And you want to identify separately the effects of age, the effects of birth cohort, and the effects of time, right? By having data on the observed risky portfolio shares, right? Over time. First of all, let's define age, time, and cohort effects so that we understand where they are coming from. So the age effect should be just the effect of becoming older by 1 year. Not of anything else. Not of anything that comes with that, right? But just because the length of my horizon goes down, if you like. The length of my remaining horizon goes down. and my age goes, when my age goes up, what is the effect of that on the risky portfolio share? Okay? The cohort effect has to do with conditions in my formative years. That's why we're looking at birth cohort, etc. So this generation of children now, they are, coming out of the womb with an iPhone and a tablet on their hands or something like that, right? And I see, it's completely ridiculous. I see, 4-year-olds at restaurants where their parents are giving them, just throwing a tablet in front of them, and they don't have to deal with them at all because they are always, going crazy with that. So, so that's a very different generation from your generation or from my generation, okay? Now, you may say, okay, is it about tablets and about, well, partly it is about that. It is when you were in the formative years, especially in the education years, in the early experiences years, etc., how much information did you have? What was available around you? What was there to learn, right? You hear nowadays older people saying, I can't get used to a computer, I can't get used to the smartphone, I can't get used to this, that, or the other, but because they were not in existence, not even remotely, when they were in their formative years and when they were acquiring experiences and abilities to handle things, right? So the birth cohort can matter for the risky portfolio share because of these early life events, if you like, and formative year events, etc. Then you go to time, and you say, okay, I'm controlling for age, I'm controlling for birth cohort. Why should time matter here? And this is really to capture macroeconomic conditions, factors that affect everybody because of the time of observation, okay? So maybe I'm collecting data at a time of a recession, high unemployment. Maybe I'm collecting data at the time of, a high inflationary episode or something like that. Maybe there is fiscal austerity. Maybe there is lax monetary policy. All of these factors could be influencing my risky portfolio share. Given my age and given my birth cohort, these are the macro conditions that influence everybody. Okay. So here you see a sort of verbal description of these things. What is the problem? What is the identification problem? Well, the identification problem is a little bit, like I was discussing before, except before there was no problem, and here it is. These three things that you are trying to separately identify are linked by an identity. Your age is identically equal to the difference between the current time and your birth year, right? So the three effects, I cannot say I'm keeping age constant and I'm varying time. I'm keeping, age and birth year constant and I'm varying time. Because if I know the age and I know the birth year, I know time, right? There is no way to keep the two things constant and vary the third thing so as to identify the separate effect. Okay? You see what I'm saying? So that's a bummer. That's a big problem, right? So we need further assumptions to be able to separately identify at least two of the three, if not all three. Okay. So here comes the beauty of the Amex and Zeldis paper. They have a bunch of examples that are completely unrealistic, but they illustrate the point. So suppose you have this ridiculous but instructive hypothetical portfolio share data. So you collect data in 3 different years, right? And suppose it is, in 3 consecutive years. So T plus 1, T plus 2, right? So these are the observations for the cross-section that you interview in DLT. What is ridiculous, everybody, regardless of age here, is reporting to you the same risky portfolio share. I mean, you won't get that in the day, but they want to illustrate something. Okay, so suppose they all tell you the same risky portfolio share regardless of age when you interview them in period T. And you interview them again, the same people in period T plus 1, and they are giving you a different risky portfolio share, but still the same across the different ages plotted here. And you're interviewing them again in T plus 2, and again they're giving you a different risky portfolio share, but the same independent of age. So here, it would appear that the age effect is 0, right? Regardless of age, in each year, they are giving you the same answer. But can we draw this inference? And it turns out we cannot. It's not so simple. We can separately identify 2 of the 3 factors, right? Age, time, and cohort effect. We are going to have to kill one of the 3 factors to identify the other 2. We are interested in estimating age effect, right? So we are not going to kill age. So we either have to kill the cohort effect or we have to kill the time effect. If we kill the cohort effect, we can estimate age and time. If we kill the time, we can estimate age and cohort. Right? So suppose we decide that cohort effects are 0. We should kill them. That they're not so important for us. Okay? So we assume, right? We can't estimate all 3. We assume that cohort effects are 0. Which means that we shouldn't care about the cohort of these people, we should just care about their age and about their time. So here is, we should care about time. So here I'm linking all the observations that are collected in the same time. And again, all the observations are collected in T plus 1, all the observations are collected in T plus 2. Okay. What is the time effect? Right? We see that if you consider anybody of any age and you go from T to T plus 1, the time effect is 1 percentage point. If you go from T plus 1 to T plus 2, so you have a positive time effect, right? For a given age. And assuming 0 cohort. Okay. What is the age effect? For the age effect, I have killed cohort. I have to estimate the age effect for a given time. So what is the age effect? For a given time and for all times, the age effect is 0. So you get positive time effect, 0 age effect. And you have killed the cohort. And you may say, we're done. Age effects are 0. Okay? But suppose now you have made the opposite assumption. You have said to yourself or convinced yourself that actually time doesn't matter It's all about cohort, right? That's very important. You know, what you learned when you were young, etc. That shapes your attitudes to risk and to the stock market, etc. So that's what's important, and not the policy now from one year to the next. That's not going to influence your risky portfolio share much, okay? So here, what you are doing is you are ignoring time. You are ignoring when you collected the data, right? You're killing time effects. But you don't want to kill cohort effects, so you have to track the same cohort over time, right? So this person was, at year T, was 40 years old. 1 year later, the same person was 41. 1 year later, the same person was 42. So this is how the cohort of that person behaved in your data, right? And you can do this for every cohort, right? So here's another cohort, here's another. You can do it, you can connect all the dots in this direction. Now, what have you done? What is the cohort effect? So consider this person over here. This person comes from the next cohort, right? From the previous cohort. So this person is 41 when this cohort is 40. This cohort is 41, right? So this person was born 1 year earlier. So this is an older cohort, okay? So by going from the older cohort to the younger cohort, what is the cohort effect? It's positive. So the younger people who were more recently educated, right, at the same age, at age 41, are holding a higher risky portfolio share. You see that? This cohort that was born after this cohort, and after this cohort, etc. So this cohort, when it has the same age, when it gets to age 41, will be holding more stocks than the previous cohort was holding at age 41. You know what I mean? Time doesn't matter, right? I ignore completely that I am collecting these data at different points in time, because time, I have assumed time doesn't matter. All I care about is the cohort. How is the cohort behaving? So I'm connecting the dots of the cohort, right? And I'm comparing different cohorts at the same age. The cohort effect is the change associated with changing the cohort for a given age, right? So this is a younger cohort, a more recent cohort. This is a more distant cohort. When they are at the same age, the more recent cohort is investing more in the stock market. Yeah? You see that? So you get a positive cohort effect. That's the first thing. There is no time effect, I killed it. What is the age effect? Well, the age effect you get from following the same cohort over time, right? As it ages. Cohort matters and age matters. So the age for the cohort effect, I fix age, 42, 41, and I consider different cohorts. For the age effect, I fix the cohort, and I consider different ages of the same cohort, right? So here is one cohort as it ages, and you see that as it ages, the cohort invests more in the stock market. Here is another cohort as it ages. Again, it invests more. Again, it invests more. So what am I getting from here? I'm getting positive age effects. So here I got 0 age effects. Here I'm getting positive age effects. And it's the same data. It's exactly the same data. The only thing I did differently was my arbitrary assumption of what to ignore. I ignored time in the first case, and I got 0 age effects. I ignored cohort in the first case, and I got 0 age effects. I ignored time in the second case, I got positive age. So what is correct? I don't know. Because, my initial assumption is arbitrary, right? You see why this paper didn't get published? Because I don't know is not good enough. Not good enough. Well, they provide more than this, but you will see. Case number 2, equally ridiculous, right? This is just to illustrate things. So suppose you are collecting data in 3 different waves at time t, t plus 1, t plus 2. Now it's not the case that everybody is giving you the same risky portfolio share in each wave. They are giving you something like this. So the younger people are investing more, the older people are investing less at any given time that you are interviewing them, okay? So you have this downward sloping thing. What choices do you have? You have exactly the same choices as before. One choice is forget cohort, right? Just focus on time, okay? So what is the time effect? So I have killed cohort effects. What is the time effect? Well, for a given age, how does time affect your risky portfolio share? And we see here that in all cases, for a given age, the passage of time increases risky portfolio share, right? So you get a positive time effect. You have killed the cohort. How about age? Well, cohort doesn't matter, time does. So for a given time, what is happening to the portfolio as age goes up? Well, you get a negative age effect. Okay? For a given time, as age goes up, the risky portfolio share goes down. That's the negative age effect over here, right? So that's the conclusion if you assume no cohort effect, if you kill cohort effect. Now, suppose you kill time effects. You don't care about when you collected the data, but you care about the cohort from which the data came. So here is the cohort that was 55 at t is 56 at t plus 1, 57 at t plus 2. Here is another cohort, here is another cohort. Okay, so what is the cohort effect? Well, the cohort effect is positive, again, because the earlier cohort in age 56 had only this, and the more recent cohort has this, risky portfolio share. So you get a positive cohort, right? As we had before. This is the positive cohort. You see this? Yes? What is the age effect? Well, time doesn't matter, cohort does. I'm following the same cohort over time. What is the age effect? 0. 0 age effect. So what's going on? I made one assumption, I kill cohorts, I get a negative age effect. I kill time, I get 0 age effect. What a mess. Huh? I don't know, again, what's going on, right? How about this case? Now this case is the most difficult to interpret because things are changing. I mean, but it's also possible. I mean, okay, it's highly idealized, you're not going to get this kind of data, but it may look like. Okay, so what do I have here? So I collect data in period t, and people of different ages are giving me now rising risky portfolio share, right? I collect data in period t plus 1, and they are all giving me the same risky portfolio share. I collect data in t plus 2, they are giving me declining. The older people are giving me a lower risky portfolio share than the younger. Okay. So if I kill cohorts, right, cohort effects, and I just focus on time, I am getting, I just focus on time and I say that time is important, then the age effect I'm getting depends on time. So in the first period, you know, with these macro policies, I was getting an increasing, you know, I was getting a positive age effect. In this period, I'm getting a zero age effect. In this period, with different macro policies, I'm getting a negative age effect. So I have an interaction between time and age effects, right? So at different times, the age effect is different, right? It's not independent. The age effect itself depends on time. But if I had killed time and I had focused on cohorts, what do I get here? Here is an age effect for this cohort. Here is an age effect for that cohort, and it's flatter. Here is an age effect for this cohort, and it's even flatter. So what do I get here? I get an interaction between cohort and age effects. So the age effect itself, the magnitude of the age effect, depends on the cohort, and it varies across cohorts. So that's even more complicated. But still, even in this very complicated setup, I don't know whether, you know, the age effect looks like this, that I should be focusing on, or the age effect looks like this, the one that I should be focusing on, right? Even in this case, it's a matter of arbitrary choice, the initial arbitrary choice. Okay, so let's go to real data, and they got TIAA-CREF data, and back then, this was really, you know, you may say, why did they focus on US academics? This is actually US-based academics. This was actually a fantastic opportunity to observe portfolio behavior over many years, right, in a panel data set, because we had the survey of consumer finances existed, but the survey of consumer finances is a time series of cross-sections. The survey of consumer finances is not panel data. It doesn't follow the same people over time. In every year, it asks different people. But with this type of data, the TIAA-CREF data, they could follow the same people. What have I done here? It's 2:45. Yes, good. It's good you stood up. So now we're doing, okay, it's a good place to stop. We are, before we talk about data. Okay, let's come back at 3. You see, I